good morning or good evening or good afternoon to everyone, because we come from different time zones of the world. This is the session number S75.5, entitled History Matters, the Value of the Humanities in Natural History Museums. And I'm your moderator, I'm Dorit Volenitz, and my helper is Maria Hekele. This session will be recorded for later interviewing. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you all to all the speakers in this session. Each presenter will present for 10 minutes. There will be 5 minutes of questions at the end of each presentation and time to transition between presenters. Please ask questions at the of the speakers using the question and answers feature found at the bottom of your screen, and this will be asked of the presenters by the moderator in an order they are received. The chat function has been made available for technical questions or for conversing with other attendees. Please use this judiciously, as any nefarious or inappropriate use of the chat may result in you being removed from the session or the chat function being disabled. Please see our code of conduct documents for more information. Please bear with any technical difficulties we may have and enjoy the session. We have now about 332 participants only on the Zoom, and we might have some more on the YouTube channel, which is also live streaming. So it's very nice. I don't know if you know, but we have 1,700 participants in the conference as a whole, which is a very impressive, very impressive. I've never been to conference. I've been, but it's not unusual. So we will begin with the first speaker, which is Wessel Broekhuis, and he will tell us about animals brought from every part of the globe, a study of the imperialist aspect of the first generation of zoological societies in the 19th century.
Yes.
So I will just go to your presentation. And just tell me when to move the...
Yes, I will. Thank you.
You need to share your screen, Dorit.
I'm trying to do that. Share screen, okay. Now, can you see it?
No.
Just a moment. It says, Andy, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. So I cannot share my screen. Andy?
Try now.
Now we can.
Okay.
So now,
Okay.
Can you see it?
Yes, yes. Can I begin?
Yes, go ahead, Wessel.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Animals brought from every part of the globe, a study of the imperialist aspect of the first generation of zoological societies in the 19th century, was the title of my master's thesis at the University of Amsterdam, written in 2019. And it was undertaken as an inquiry into the imperialist and nationalist aspect of 19th century and early 20th century zoological societies. And the aim is to get a full view on how these institutions were connected to the colonies and if embodying an imperialist ideology was an aspect of the early zoological societies. Did the gardens of these societies express pride of colonial dominance in a way that was similar to museums and world exhibitions? Subjects of research were the Zoological Society of London, founded in 1826, Amsterdam's Natura Artis Magistra, founded in 1838, and the Antwerp Royal Society for Zoology, founded in 1843. And these are three of the oldest zoological societies, which were inspired by one another and are thus linked through many aspects. If we go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Yes, we see samples of the primary source material I've used for my research, correspondence, catalogs of animal dealers in middle and newspaper articles, as well as imagery and of course secondary literature. And this is a research I'm still continuing. If we go to the next slide, the original mission statements of these three zoological societies, all published in their time, shared many similarities, such as the aim for conducting scientific research and the exclusive nature of these institutions, because at first they were only accessible to paying members. But another apparent similarity is the wish to contribute to the establishment of collective pride of the nation, as well of the city these societies were based in. And this sense of pride was related to national, commercial, and political successes, as well as royal patronage. And nationalist competition was also an important incentive behind the founding of these societies across Europe, because nations wanted to keep up with one another in terms of scientific knowledge and progress. And all this is visualized really well in the cover of this 1854 annual report of the Amsterdam Society, where we see Amsterdam's city maiden holding the crest of Amsterdam and all the riches that the world has to offer surrounding an anchor, musical instruments, and of course, and a globe. And then the next question was how these societies gained their collections and whether a colonial network existed. And if we go to the next slide, it appears that in all three animals were most commonly gifted to these societies, either by royal houses, who by doing so affirmed their bonds to these institutions, or by foreign nobles or officials, and most prominently by members of these societies, many of which were colonial officials and contributed to the societies not only by paying their membership fee, but also by donating animals. And as a newspaper article from 1855 described, the stream of barbaric offerings flowing from tropical princes towards London's zoo. And this definitely helped stamping a national character on the institution. And here on this image, we see an inventory, a report of animals brought by the Prince of Wales from India to London. And it's remarkable that he thought those animals would be displayed better in the gardens of the Zoological Society than instead of his own private grounds. And donating animals reflects a process that proves to be strongly linked with the colonial territories of the respective countries. And the colonies of a country were reflected in its zoo. London Zoo housed many animals from India, Artis in Amsterdam from Indonesia and Suriname, and Antwerp from Congo. And this helped strengthen the ideological element of this institution. If we go to the next slide. Lastly, once the animals reached the gardens, I wanted to know whether they were presented in an imperialist context. And to answer that question, I examined multiple aspects of the 19th century zoo. It can be argued that the early societies did not so much show the diversity of nature from a scientific point of view, as well as the dominance of man over nature by showcasing species in an orderly manner in paddocks, cages, and buildings. and that what was being celebrated in these gardens was not nature itself, but the appropriation of nature by man. And if we go to the next slide, contemporary zoo buildings were often modeled after temples, mosques, huts, and such. And these buildings mirrored the architecture of the land of origin of the animal that was housed in such a building. This is a prominent example, the Egyptian temple in Antwerp Zoo, built in 1856. On the next slide, we see the Elephant Pagoda in Berlin Zoo from 1875, and then on the next slide, we see the Minangkabau's house from 1915 in Amsterdam, which was modeled after the architectural style of the Minangkabau people on Sulawesi in Indonesia. Then, next slide, zoo animals often became icons, representatives of their foreign imperialized homelands, national pets that sparked the imagination of the city's populace. And by riding animals such as elephants, visitors could partake in colonial dominance. Next slide. In some cases, foreign humans lived alongside these animals. Examples are the Nubians who brought the first giraffes to London Zoo in 1836 and stayed for a few months. Hamed, we see him here, the keeper who lived side by side with Obège, the first hippo of London Zoo. And then on the next slide, Jefke, the doorman of Antwerp Zoo, who had come to Belgium as a kid with a shipment of birds. These people received a wage, because if we go to the next slide, we see a receipt for Hamed, the hippo keeper, and they were free to leave when they seemed fit, but it is undeniable that they were objectified and that their otherness was always emphasized, and that they contributed to the exotic experience that the 19th century zoo offered. On the next slide, we see the ethnographical museum in Amsterdam Zoo, which was as substantial as its zoological, botanical, and geological collections, and proved the economic value of the Dutch colonies. And on the next slide, we see a visit of the Dutch Queen to the zoo in 1911, and people from the Dutch colonies were present, bowing in a veneration. Experiencing all this colonial splendor in the city provided self-affirming pride to the visitors. Next slide. My conclusion was that there was definitely an imperialist element to these institutions because of the way animals were brought to the zoo, either as diplomatic gifts or gifts from colonial officials, and because of royal patronage. Zoos were not purely a tool of the empire, but this important aspect of their history is not to be ignored either. Last slide. The question I would like to pose today, or give you something to think about, is whether further study on the significance of this colonial past could and or should be incorporated in the educational mission and conceptual vision of modern day zoos. Thank you very much for listening. Are there any questions?
Do we have any questions?
In the Q&A, someone, Kimberly Cook, asks, can you speak to the connection between these zoos and circuses? Well, these early zoological societies set themselves quite apart from circuses, because they, in their mission statements, they aimed for the scientific study of nature. So animals would not perform tricks in these sorts of gardens. At the same time, that scientific aim is a bit ambiguous, because as you see, animals were being ridden and such. But they were quite set apart from circuses. Martin Christiansen asks, do you have any recommendation for decolonizing our collection? Decolonizing collection. This is something I think a lot of thought should be put into, and I think the first step in decolonizing would be educating and maybe letting visitors partake in thinking about these topics. Helen Robbins asked, do you see these nationalist ideology, iconography in contemporary zoological contexts? Well, actually I do. There's, for example, very recently a new lion exhibit was built in London Zoo. And it's modeled after an Indian temple complex. It houses Asiatic lions. And I think that's, yeah, if I may speak openly, it feels kind of wayward to be building such, yeah, such an old-fashioned exhibit nowadays, which, yeah, offers which offers a weirdly distorted image of an exotic culture in combination with showcasing animals. I don't know if that answers the questions. Are there any more questions?
Okay, I think that, thank you, Wessel, and we will be hearing from you in the end of the session again.
Yes.
And I just wanted to say that colonization and repatriation is things that we discuss a lot in the ICOM NATHIST committee, because it's a kind of worldwide issue now.
Yes.
And you can have a look at our website and find some more information. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that, you know, that Wessel was talking about to us about zoo. And some of you may just ask themselves how zoo is connecting to natural history museums. But just to tell you that in ICOM, zoos are entitled to be members of ICOM.
Yeah.
And if you think about that, I mean, actually, zoo is a kind of a museum. It's a museum of living. And Wessel wants to say something.
No, I want to say two things. First, Amsterdam Zoo, where I am affiliated, which I'm affiliated with, used to have a zoological natural history museum as well. And it's actually reopening next year after plus 50 years of inactivity. And if there are any more questions, feel free to email me. I put my email in the presentation. Yes.
There's one now, and you still have 1 minute, so you can answer.
Okay. Let me see. Is there any understanding of these societies from a colonized point of view? That is to say, an understanding from the people and societies that were colonized? Well, that's very hard, of course, because often there's no written sources from, for example, the people who were working in those societies, the exotic people. We do know, however, that well, there's some diary entries, and these societies were very dependent on local hunters, for example, in India. But that's definitely something that could be looked into more as well in the future.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Wessel. And we need to go to the second speaker. And our second speaker is my dear Phaedra. She will be talking about Blast of the Past. a historic walking tour organized by a natural history museum. Phaedra is from the National Taiwan Museum in Taipei. And I will just share your presentation. Just a moment.
Okay.
Can you see it?
Not really.
Yeah. Just a moment. Oh, technology drives me crazy. I'll share your screen.
Okay.
Here you go, Phaedra.
Okay. Thank you, George, and hi everyone. I'm Phaedra from National Taiwan Museum. And my background is actually, I majored in zoology and now in sustainable development. And the co-author is the cultural heritage expert in our museum. And today I'm going to share with you a historic tour organized by Natural History Museum, our museum. And you can see it in the picture. Next slide, please. And this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the concept of our of this walking tour, and why did the museum started this tour, and how does it work, and also sharing with you some prospects if we still have time. Next slide. So to talk about the concept of this walking tour, I would like to introduce our museum a little bit. Please, next slide. So the top left picture, that is our main building. It's actually the oldest still standing natural history museum in Taiwan, founded in 1908. And it's situated in the capital of Taiwan, that is Taipei City. You can see at the little map down there, the green square, and we can well zoom in to see the downtown area of Taipei. So in that orange square, you see the yellow dotted line that circles the old walled city during Qing Dynasty in Taipei, and it was also the third major settlements in Taipei, and our museum is just right in the middle of it. Next slide, please. And obviously we have more than one branch. We have the main building showcasing the natural and cultural diversity of Taiwan. We also have the second branch using the elevated space to exhibit the dinosaurs. And we also have the third branch, Namen Park, which used to be a camphor factory, and we use it to showcase industrial history. And we now have the fourth branch opening in this July. It used to be the railway department building, administration building. So we are using this branch to present the modernity of Taiwan. So with all these branches, the buildings were actually the official buildings during Japanese colonial period. So obviously we have this thick, very obvious colonial past. And now we are trying to reuse, utilize these cultural heritage to show Taiwan in depth. So this is what we call National Taiwan Museum System. Please, next slide. And as you can see, this old wall city I just mentioned. Next. So, sorry, next slide. I believe there's probably some animation. Sorry, next slide. And next. And next. Yes, so you can, sorry, the previous one. Previous one, sorry. The previous map actually shows that all 4 branches of museum forms axis of this old world city, what we call the cultural axis of Taipei. And we are now trying to promote different aspects of the development of Taiwan, especially the development of modern society of Taiwan with this cultural axis. Next slide. So what I did is that I initiated a walking tour to connect our museum branches and also to present some major cultural heritage sites in this old world city and trying to showcase how Taiwan, especially Taipei, come into form in this just very quick 200 years. Next slide. And it is conducted in English. As you can see, these are international docents. So the tourists can learn about Taiwan in depth with our walking tour. Next slide. And we are not just talking about, you know, peace and happy stories. We actually would talk about some dark histories. Yes, you can, next slide, next click. And we talked about the foundation of the city, but we also talked about how architectural details or styles would represent ideology. We also talked about how some of the collections in the museums were ill-gotten. And we also talked about some transitional justice issues with these cultural heritage sites and also women's rights. Next slide. And why do we do that? Please, next slide. If you look at a little bit of our modern history from late 17th century to 1990s, you will see that Taiwan has actually gone through 3 different periods, 3 change of powers from Qing dynasty to Japanese colonial period. And after World War II, we were ruled by an authoritarian regime by the Chinese Nationalist Party. And so in this short period of time, we've gone through several changes, and each of these periods, they tried to showcase ideology with a different kind of architectures or heritage they left. Next slide. And this is a picture showing during World War II, Taiwan was actually bombed by the Allied forces. By Allied forces, I mean the US. And because Taiwan was part of Japanese colonial government, so Taiwan was in the Axis power. And this is why a lot of places in Taiwan was bombed. And after World War II, a lot of these cultural heritage actually suffer from, you know, recovering. Some were lucky enough to be recovered. Some, for example, next slide. The first ever department store in Taiwan, as the left picture, was actually covered in glass curtain. And this is just one of the examples of ill-treated cultural heritage in Taiwan. Because of this, a lot of Taiwanese people actually didn't know how this modern society come into form. Next slide. And this is our museum. Luckily, we survived the bombing, but we survived another thing because it was established by the colonial government. So after World War II, the Chinese Nationalist Party actually had their more favorable museums. And this is how our museum then leapt into some sort of unspeakable use. Next slide, please. This is in 1932 during Japanese period. Next slide. And this is after World War II, when the museum was basically sometimes covered up by some exhibitions non-relevant to natural history. Next slide. And this is also another example where the history was celebrated. Unfortunately, the history wasn't really the history of the local area, but the history of the government from mainland. Next slide. And finally, in recent years, we started this National Taiwan Museum system, and we renovated and tried to restore all these cultural heritage. Next slide. And I'll just be showing you how these cultural heritage got renovated and utilized. Next slide. This is our second branch. Next slide. And it used to be a bank. Next slide. And now it's a place where everybody can come in, just not for the bankers. Next slide. And this is Nanmen branch, which used to be the factory of camphor. And that was actually a kind of blood diamond industry in Taiwan. And we now change it into the museum. But yeah, also come through some ugly period. Next slide, please. The factory, next slide, during Japanese period. And it was when it was left. Yes, next slide, sorry. And now renovated. Next slide, sorry. And this is what it looks like right now. And next slide. We're using it to promote environmental history. And this is our fourth branch. Next slide. And next one. And yeah, sorry, next one. So this is what it looks like right now. So does it work? Next slide. Yes, it does. So a lot of people actually joined this walking tour, also local students, the only high school in this area. Next slide. And also a lot of people from different cultural backgrounds get to know our museum and connected with the museum. Next slide. So everybody has a say in this space. Next slide, sir. In different languages. Next slide. And current challenges is probably COVID-19. And I would like to receive questions. I'm sure I'm probably out of time. Yes, so I think I will be receiving questions. And if there is no questions, I would probably add something. So basically, okay, I see questions. How do you consider virtual tours? So the situation in Taiwan is actually quite in control. We have a consecutive 57 days without local cases, and we are opening up. So we are having physical tours very soon. But we are also considering virtual tours so that we can promote these things to the public overseas. And the concept is that we are transforming what used to be a very authoritarian top-down institutions into spaces everybody can participate in and interpret it. Do you manage the materials in 22 languages? Unfortunately, because we recruit international students into this docent training program to give the tours. So it is the students using their mother language to introduce the museum. So that's why we have 22 languages.
Any more questions?
Do you include the tours, the history and development of, also Anna has a question, do you include tour history and development of the collections relevant to these buildings? So this is a very interesting question. Another very interesting concept of this tour is that we treat these architectures, the architectures of our museum as a kind of collection of the museum, because we have a lot of studies during the renovation. So during our tour, we basically talk about how these architectures come into being. For example, the main building of our museum is a vivid neoclassical building, and it was built in 1915 because the Japanese were in their early stage of colonization and they want to show their power. So they just borrowed the architectural languages from Greek and Roman architectures so that they can show, oh, we are the Enlightenment. So that was the gag. And I think it's already a very interesting part. And we were introducing these. We are just like introducing the collections inside the museum. So in this tour, we are treating the architectures as the collections of our museum, but it's another category.
Okay, thank you very much, Phaedra, and we will move to the next speakers.
Thank you.
We will have Patti Wood Finkle and Valerie Inella Meyers. They will be talking about Werner Wildlife Museum, 50 years and who counts. And I will just share your screen. Can you see it?
Not yet.
Can you see it now?
Thank you, yes. Hello, and thank you all for sharing time with us today. We are located in rural Wyoming in the United States. And the prompt for this presentation was the research that we had been conducting to understand the history of the Werner Wildlife Museum. And connecting with some of the other speakers, obviously we too have problematic issues of displaying and educating about the natural world through a paradigm of dominance and conquest. So connecting to the humanities is very important to us. Next slide, please. The museum was gifted to our larger institution, Casper College, about 50 years ago. A prominent rancher here in Wyoming was also an avid hunter. And exploring the natural world, I believe, is important to education and an innate human interest. And thus this institution has provided, through the generosity of this rancher, an opportunity for generations to explore various environments, from our prairie to the polar ice caps. The land was actually donated by our city, as I found when researching the history of the institution. And then the structure itself was built through the generosity of this rancher, Herman Werner, for whom the museum is named. Construction occurred, and Werner had a vision of displaying not only natural history specimens from his collection, but also works of art. So there was a really wonderful connection in the vision of this man early on. And most of what we know about that vision comes from interviews through newspaper articles. And so I have spent a lot of time at our Western History Center archives, located also here at our institution, Casper College, to look at this history. Next slide, please. And the museum is fortunate to welcome over 6,000 people a year. And we are charged not only with allowing this exploration of the natural world, but being appropriate to the curricular needs of science students, art students, history students. We have myriad functions within our community. while we are trying to serve these educational needs, we are also looking at how we can serve the broader community in a meaningful manner. However, as we have discussed, there are stigmas attached to this collection. In particular, the Ullery collection, you can see one of the specimens in this particular slide of the PowerPoint, is one that was donated to the institution, but it was donated with the stipulation that it would not be changed or basically touched for many years. And thus it is in a very compressed space, and it can be an issue to even think about preservation concerns for this part of the legacy. Next slide, please. Herman Werner was really instrumental in founding the museum, but we've had donations from many people within our community, as well as government institutions. We have partnered with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We have a booth every year at the Wyoming Game and Fish Expo, and we try to host as many activities as possible at the institution while reaching out to the public. Next slide, please. The museum has obviously been heavily connected to the college, and we have had members of the science division serving as directors, curators, and educators. In this photo, you see a diorama that was built in a partnership between some of the sister colleges in Wyoming and our biology department. Next slide, please. And these partnerships have grown over time. Obviously, attendance at the museum has grown over time, along with staffing. These partnerships not only include these organizations, but also within our college community. Next slide. Some of the newer exhibitions include the taxidermy shop. Next slide. And the Grand Slam that you see here of mountain sheep from North and Central America. We are also adding new backdrops to these exhibits to allow for a greater understanding of the environment of this particular specimens in this collection. Next slide. And so the future of the museum, I believe, is critical within our community, but we need to explore how we can really partner throughout our institution more effectively and throughout our community. And now I'm going to turn over the presentation to Patti Finkle. I serve on the advisory board, but she is the director of the museum.
Hi, everyone. So I'm quickly going to run through kind of where we see ourselves going. So Valerie talked very well about our past and where we've been. And I kind of want to talk about the future, the next 50 years. So if we could go to the next slide. Like Val said, we are part of Casper College, and we are a very small museum. You can see the first picture was when the museum was built 50 years ago, and the second picture is current. Next slide, please. In the past, the museum wasn't necessarily managed by people who had any kind of a museum background. So we don't have a lot of records, we don't have a lot of donation forms, we don't have a lot of information about where some of these animals came from. So that was part of the research project that we undertook, was to delve into the history of these collections. Next slide, please. When I started 11 years ago, the collection wasn't accessioned, it wasn't cataloged, there was no, like I said, information about it. So to begin, we went through, and I had volunteers and our collections manager at the Tate Zoological Museum, which is also here on campus, helped me catalog and clean all of the collections. Oh, all right, it was a big job, sorry, I'm gonna go fast now. Next slide. To bring the humanities into the Natural History Museum so that we weren't just a biology museum, we decided to reach out. We've reached out to art departments, and they come in, they have their art classes come in and do creative drawing and sculpture, and we also host an art show. We have BLM here showing school children during the summer, during our new summer programs, different information. I think they're talking about raptors right there. We have a monthly talk, Animal House talk, that we have a local citizen scientist come in and give a program. We also hosted a writers group, and we do it every spring semester. That's a new one, in conjunction with the English department here on campus. And we're trying to tell people and show people that the museum can be used as a creative space as well, that we want to be used for the sciences, and we are used by the science departments, but we also want to be used on campus by the other departments. So coming up with these programs helped us to reach out to the departments that perhaps didn't think that they had a place in either the Werner Wildlife Museum or the Tate Geological Museum. We also now have art classes and photography classes coming up to the Tate as well, which is great, a great use of the museum. Now I'm lost. Next slide, please. Woo. All right. One of the other classes that uses the museums heavily is our museum studies class. Valerie is the professor for that class, and we bring the students in to teach them how to handle objects that are larger than a vase or larger than some of the smaller things, bigger than 2D artwork, that sort of thing. And so they come in, and usually I'll have them help me inspect the animals and do a little cleaning. We also have interns from the museum studies program here. And as a college, we have work study students. I don't know how many of you know what those are, but they're students on campus who get a job somewhere to learn something. One of the best work study students I ever had was an agricultural student, and she was super excited and very enthusiastic to learn a lot, as much as she could, about wildlife and about museums. So that was another way that we've brought new students and new audiences into the museum. Next slide. Something else we started doing in the last few years to bring in more diverse audience, thank you, is we've started hosting art shows. So we ask people to bring in their art. It's a juried art show, and it has to have something to do with wildlife. Whether it's fine art, we do a fine art show in the fall that has photography, painting, that sort of thing. And then we have an artisan show in the spring that is more leatherworking, woodworking, handicrafts even. And go ahead and go to the next slide. We also include children's activities in the open house so that we can encourage more families to come in. As part of our research into what other museums are doing, however, Valerie and I took a trip to London this last fall. All right, can I finish one slide? Okay, we took a trip to London this last fall to talk to some other university museums in another area. We are part of the Mountain Plains Museums Association here in the Rocky Mountain West, and we talk to a lot of museums in this area, but I don't have that many contacts outside of this area. So it was an interesting research visit to be able to talk to these museum professionals who were involved with University College London, the Natural History Museum in London, and see that they have some of the same concerns and some of the same issues getting in diverse audiences, and that they're giving some programs that are basically similar to the ones that we're giving in order to diversify their audiences. So, and in the end, that's our real goal. We want people to come to the museum. We want them to learn. We want them to come in and read something and learn something without realizing they're learning, because that's the best thing. And that's what excites them when they go back and talk to their friends and their family. I learned this thing, and now I'm going to share it with you. And that's what we want to inspire, is learning. And we want to inspire our community to come to the museum. And you can see here's a picture of both of our museums. We hope to combine into one single facility one day soon in the future.
And then our last slide, we posed some questions for the Q&A. We were curious, as we hope to network with all of you, if there are any partnerships that attendees have been part of at their institutions that really target the arts. We do have quite a relationship with the visual arts and also the English department, writers' workshops. But obviously we need to surmount some of the issues. And from the chat, the answer to question, yes, I think early American zoos and natural history collections really do celebrate that dominance over the natural landscape, and we continue to do this. But how can we utilize this collection in a manner that is fruitful and relevant?
We have a question. We have an advisory board, and it is made up of local people. Some of them are professionals, some of them are just retired. And we have one of our biology instructors is on the board too, and she's a new addition. And she is very interested in environmental stewardship, and she is going to help us as a museum move in that direction. We do believe it's one of our responsibilities as a museum, as a natural history museum that talks about wildlife and wildlife's environments and their habitats. And so that is a direction that we plan to move with the museum. One of the ideas that we had that came from another board member was to create a natural space on campus or right around campus somewhere that would showcase native Wyoming habitat areas, whether it was in a lowlands and did more of a boggy area, or if it was in a highlands plains area. Our campus is on a hill, a severe hill, and so we could have both of those. And that was something before COVID shut down the board for a few months that we had been seriously talking to the college about cultivating this space, and the Werner Wildlife Museum would be in charge of its maintenance. The college, of course, would help us with all of that, but we would be the responsible party for it and use it as a springboard to talk about environmental stewardship and conservation of the land.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the BioBlitz. So there is a very active Audubon here in Casper. Zach Hutchinson runs the Audubon. They don't have a center anymore, but he still does a lot of outreach. And we have been working with him to do some of the, not the bird banding, the bird counts. And actually the Tate has, one of our collections manager, JP, is a big birder, so he helps out with the BioBlitz. And one of our other volunteers, Dwayne Wagner, is the, how do I word this? He has the most positive moth and butterfly identifications for the state of Wyoming. He's a citizen scientist, self-trained. And so they help out a lot with the BioBlitz and the bird counts and the bird banding. And we have been talking to Zach about possibly using the Werner as kind of his base of operations for a while, to try to get more. We don't just want the people that want to look at taxidermy specimens. We want people that want to look at live specimens as well to come and visit us.
I really appreciate the connection to public history programs. Obviously, you heard a lot about visual art, and we do writers workshop with the English department, science department, but I think reaching out to the history department is very clever, and I hope that we will do that in the future. And I noticed this too, Fashion Archive. We actually have a costuming major through our theater department here at Casper College. That could also be a wonderful way to connect further.
Garden tour. We used to do a garden tour years ago, before I started working here. The art museum and actually the Tate worked together for this Casper garden tour, and people would open up their gardens and let people come and visit, and it was the neatest thing. But we pass that off to the Nick, correct? Mm-hmm. So the Nick, our art museum does that now, but we used to be involved with that. So that's a really neat idea.
Mm-hmm. So we will have a last question, and then we'll move to the next speaker. So,
two more. All right. Oh, that's neat. I'm reading quickly.
Oh, and someone asked about reaching out to local tribes.
Yeah. Oh, we have not reached out to local tribes, and I don't know why.
And
I have no good answer for that.
That is a very
good question.
Significant connection as well. In fact, there could be funding through our Humanities Council for that type of partnership. So thank you. Thank you all for this time.
Thank you, Valerie and Patti, and we will move to the next speaker, which is Marion Lemaire, and she will be talking about the Faculty of Science collections in Rennes, France. And in a moment, I will share your screen. Just a moment. So should I start it, Marion?
Yep. It's a prerequisite
It's
presentation.
hard to imagine how was the French university and scientific world in Brittany in particular 100 years ago at the beginning of the 20th century. The city of Rennes and the University of Rennes of today have little to do with those of the 1900s. Rennes is today a regional metropolis with 450,000 inhabitants, which hosts every year about 60,000 students in its two universities. At the beginning of the 20th century, the city hosted 17,500 inhabitants. The students at the university were about only 1,000. The majority of them came from neighboring departments. The city, which had lost its luster after the French revolutions, remained connected with the farming world, with which there were many exchanges. The academics hadn't left behind in this movement. Creations of agronomic stations in 1878, creations of a chair of applied botany to agriculture and of
We seem to have lost sound, Dorrit.
Yeah.
learning.
Now?
Of course, this object and specimen, as expressive they are, can talk. We should dive into archive, inventory registers, minutes of deliberations of professors, account books, etc. to try to The government awards to the faculty 350 francs every year to buy material, not enough to complete adequately the collections formed in 1840 at the creation of the faculty with grants of the municipality. At this time, the faculty inherited part of the collection of natural history formed from leftover of Christophe Paul de Robin's curiosity cabinet, which was confiscated during the Revolution time, as many of French natural history collections. Some elements were brought to on this occasion from specialized shops, which had been growing at this time. Then, in our inventories of our collections, on the 250 specimens of vertebrate animals dated 1814 and 1841, 70 specimens came from the Royal Company, Parisian ones, which celebrates its first 10 years. In instance, a platypus. 30 came from Grison, 70 from Kersadi, 57 from Parsagé. Until 1870 years, the situation hadn't really moved, but the French defeat in 1870 in the conflict between France and Prussia raised awareness of the French lake in education and higher training. The government, which till that time had given only 350 francs a year to maintain the collections, gave finally some resources for higher education. The courses should be practical and concrete. Material to observe was needed. Thanks to the credits opened by the Ministry of Public Education, the Faculty of Science purchased new samples, but they need to be large. On 1873, March the 5th, the 6 professors had an ultimate meeting in the dean's office. They should give an answer to the mayor of the town who wanted to know what rooms were needed for the activity of the faculty. Few meetings had occurred on these questions. Probably, it was an occasion to discuss about what is a good collection to teach natural history. Collections for studies or museum. The professor answered the questions. They yet shared their premise with the collections of municipal museums, and they claimed they didn't want to have access to veritable museums likely to attract incompetent public. I quote them. But only veritable collections for studies. In France, not for the National History Museum, which is specific, there is a distinction between natural history museum, most of time managed by municipalities, and universitary collections. Museums are dedicated to education of general public, whereas universitary collections are dedicated to teaching, even if they nowadays tend to open for all publics. Go back to the 1873. What is a good collection for education in natural history? For a good collection, professors say, we need 400 square meters, more than the 90 square meters they have at the time to lodge. A collection of comparative anatomy, 60 square meters. A general collection of zoology, 80 square meters. A botanical collection, herbarium, 40 square meters. Regional collection, 60 square meters. Thus, a room for the professor for specific instrument, laboratory for dissections, laboratory for microscopy, storeroom and depot, room for taxidermy and preparation of specimens, room for conservation. The objects are alternatively subject to conservative vapor. For geology and mineralogy, they need general collections of mineralogy, general collection of rocks, general collection of fossils, regional collections, a room for the professor for specific instruments, a laboratory for essay with a small collection for studies available for students. When they talk about collection, the professor insists several times about the necessity to have local or regional collections, because courses in classroom are complementary to training on the field. Thanks to these regional collections, the student can determine and study comparatively samples with those that they have collected during field trip. Regularly, the rector asks the professor to have a list of objects and books to purchase for the Faculty of Science. But in 1880, they gave a list of objects that they had identified before. An howler monkey, 60 francs, head of a buffalo, 230, preparation of a badger, 40 francs, skeleton of a turtle, 400 francs, skeleton of a hippo from Port Said, 1,300 francs for the shipping, and 400 francs for preparations. Since 1881, an annual budget was given for maintenance and increase of collections. The professor welcomed this point. Every year, they had to discuss the distribution of this credit. In 1881, the amount of 9,100 francs was distributed as follows. Chemistry and physics, 3,500 francs. Zoology, 3,500 francs. Geology, 1,000 francs. And botany, only 600 francs. In 1893, contability of the faculty was regulated by the decree. There was an accounting designation for collections. Government gave more credits, but in the same time wanted to have more control on universities. At this time, there were a lot of purchases for collections, specimens, but pedagogical material too. Soon, photography appeared as a teaching tool at the beginning of the 20th century. Before the First World War, the University of Rennes and its Faculty of Science were one of the main actors of the town and in Brittany. The town was flattered to have one of the 16 French universities. Nowadays, there are 75 universities. At the beginning, the Faculty of Science found resources from municipality, then from the government. At this time, the faculty continued to purchase collections to specialized shops, which were now globalized as Brandel or General or Hui-shih. This expansion was disrupted by the conflicts of the 20th century. After the Second World War, there were big transformations of higher education and collections were less and less used. We need to investigate more to know what were the mechanisms of this period. Today, collections have a new use with digitalization projects and networking, which is increasing.
Thank you, Marion. Just stop. So do you have any questions to Marion? Anyone? Questions?
I don't know if the sound is very good for the video.
I couldn't hear you.
I don't know if the sound of the video was okay.
I cannot elaborate on that because in my computer it was okay, but maybe some of the listeners can say. Okay, so we will go to the last speaker, which is Wessel Broekhuis again, and he will be talking about the story of Jack, life and legacy of the first elephant of, pardon? There's questions now.
Yeah.
Would like to answer them, Marion?
How much of the historic collections are still in use for teaching on display? We have the amount of all the collections is 1 million items. I think that there is about 10% which are still used for teaching. Okay.
Okay. I believe that there was it was difficult to hear the voice of in the movie, but there is a recording, and I hope it will be better when you watch it on the recording. Okay, so my apology, technology is not.
And I can let my emails if someone wants to ask me a question by mail. There's no problem.
Okay, so we move to Wessel. Wessel, please. Just a moment. I need to share your screen. Here you are.
Right. Thank you all for listening to me again. So this time, yes, with another history relating to early zoological societies. because this is the story of the first elephant of the Amsterdam Zoological Society, Natura, Artis, Magistra. In 1839, the Amsterdam Zoological Society, Natura, Artis, Magistra, founded only a year earlier, acquired her first elephant for its zoo. And it was an Asiatic elephant bull named Jack. And my research project attempted to uncover and describe as many details of Jack's life as possible in order to arrive at an understanding of the animal's life as a new way to describe the meaning of zoo animals past and present. And this project was intended to write a biography about a non-human being, and that may seem unconventional, but works well within the contemporary tendency of the humanities to take an interest in the natural world. I examined the municipal archives of Amsterdam and the archives of Artis Royal Zoo and the inventories of animal traders and advertisements of traveling animal collections, 19th century newspaper articles, as well as old photographs and artworks. Next slide, please. The bull Jack was originally brought to Europe from Ceylon. Sometime early 19th century, elephants were hunted on Ceylon by the British for sport as well for the tusks, or to become part of the traveling menageries and upcoming zoological gardens across Europe. Jack must have been very young when he was captured and brought over, because a small baby elephant was of course easier to transport by ship than a full-grown one, and this usually meant that the protective mother had to be shot in the process of capturing an animal. And Jack became property of the Van Aken family. And the Van Akens were a Dutch family whose members all ran traveling menageries. And these animal collections traveled from city to city on mainland Europe and the United Kingdom. And they could be described as a cross between a zoo, a circus, and a market, because visitors could watch various kinds of exotic animals who would often perform tricks. And we know that Jack was praised for being able to play musical instruments, fire a gun, and chug bottles of wine. And we see some of his antics on these engravings. And nobles with an interest in the natural world would visit these menageries to acquire exotic animals for their personal collections. Mentions of an elephant in newspaper announcements and pamphlets suggest that Jack has changed hands several times between the Van Aken brothers, and by the late 1830s, Jack was the crowning jewel in the collection of Cornelis van Aken. And if we go to the next slide, Van Aken's collection included a wide variety of animals: lions, tigers, polar bears, hyenas, zebras, kangaroos, jackals, monkeys, and a giant snake. And here we see a price list of his collection with on top, it says a tamed elephant. And the fledgling Zoological Society of Amsterdam, Artis, was interested in acquiring Van Aken's complete collection to enlarge the number of animals in their garden. And after a year of price negotiations, the menagerie was bought for the sum of 34,000 guilders. And Jack was the most valuable animal at 5,000 guilders. And for comparison, at the time, 200 guilders was a good wage for the average worker or office cleric. So it was an enormous amount of money. Next slide. Once bought by the society, the elephant became its main showpiece. And from 1847 onwards, however, after having stayed at the zoo for a few years, Jack proved to be increasingly unmanageable. He was prone to fits of rage and would often demolish his stable and fence. And at the time, little was known about the behavior of elephants and how to provide adequate care and housing for them in captivity. And nowadays, we would attribute the described fits of rage to boredom and the undersized and unchallenging paddock and stable he was staying in, a solitary life Jack led, while animals are highly social animals who live in herds. Also, the so-called oestrus rage, must, that bull elephants get into when they reach sexual activity around the age of 15, but he didn't have an elephant cow to mate with. When the situation became increasingly dangerous and fear of Jack escaping grew, he was killed by gunshots and poison in 1849. And if we go to the next slide, the dead Jack was documented in a moving watercolor by Conradijn Cuneus, and it shows how his passing must have been as dramatic an event as his arrival in the zoo. His skeleton, next slide, was thereafter displayed in the Museum of the Society, the so-called Grote Museum, built as a natural history museum around 1852, amidst other skeletons and stuffed animals. And his ribs, crushed by the bullet impacts, were proof of the violent end he met. And in a museum, held up by a monumental cast iron construction, he once again became the pride of the Zoological Society, only now in a lifeless form. And on the next slide, we have more images. Yeah, here's various images of Jack in the halls of the Zoological Museum of the Zoological Society of Amsterdam. And never before had there been a possibility in the Dutch capital to study the anatomy of an elephant from so close by. And here we also see the iron cast that supported his skeleton. Jack offered a rare first museological confrontation with the exotic natural world, subject to the eyes of both the curious, the scientist, and the artist. Jack contributed to the acceptance of the Natural History Museum and the zoo as an institutional space to consume nature. This episode in the history of artists not only appeals to the imagination, it can tell us a great deal about the spirit of the times with regard to the relationships between man and nature, the West and the colonies, and the development and shifting role of zoological parks and natural history collections since their inception up to this present day. Jack's skeleton and story is of both natural and cultural historical importance and relates a valuable tale about our changing way of looking at and interacting with nature. Jack and other animals that were plucked from nature in the 19th century served to impress, entertain, and possibly also to express the ability of humanity to subjugate nature in the era of imperialism, as I talked about in my previous presentation. And nowadays, Jack's skeleton and the images and the stories that remain of him serve as a monument for an animal life and a possible discussion hub for our changing views on nature. Question I would like to pose to you is whether you know similar stories that can contribute to the stories that Natural History Institution want to tell in this current day and age. Thank you for listening once again. Are there any questions? Oh, yeah, and last, can you show the last slide? No. No.
What were you saying?
Oh, is it possible to show the last slide? I forgot while I answer questions.
There is no
There's
more
one.
slides. That's
No,
like the last.
Yeah, oh, there should be one after this.
There isn't.
Oh, that's my mistake then. Okay. All right. Well, I'll answer some questions. Where is Jack now? Jack is in storage right now, and the museum he used to be in is being renovated right now. It has been closed since 1950, I believe, and it will reopen next year. But I don't know if Jack will be a part of the museum. I hope he will be, because he offers a valuable tale about our changing interactions with nature. how do you see the connection between richness in the societies and evolution of animals, animal commercialization and domestication, and relation with science? Well, that's a very interesting one. And for that topic, it's best to look at the Zoological Society of London, who in their first decades had the so-called Acclimatization Project. And that was a project which involved the aim of introducing exotic species, such as pheasants from Asia, zebra, antelopes, deer, etc., into British nature as livestock or game animals. Yeah, they try to really introduce exotic nature into the British islands. This is a venture that proved to be largely unsuccessful, but even if it wasn't successful, it is very telling of the approach and stance on nature at the time. And you could describe the acclimatization process project as part of what I call imperial zoology. Who were the animal traders, and what was the monetary worth of animal trade in the 18th and 19th century? Well, in the 18th century, animal trade was, you know, a side activity of sailors and such. And in the 19th century, when early zoological societies really took off, animal trade became big business. The most famous animal trader is called Carl Hagenbeck. He was a German man, and his whole family was in the animal trade. But Carl Hagenbeck became most famous. And by the late 19th, early 20th century, basically all of the European, but also American zoos were filled with animals that were provided by Hagenbeck, and he had his agents all around the globe. Why was Jack mounted as a skeleton rather than a taxidermist mount? I wouldn't know, but of course he was shot, so maybe his skin wasn't intact anymore. I wouldn't know about that. Good question, though. Are you aware of the story of the female rhino Clara? Yes, I am. There's many of these interesting stories, animal biographies. The story of the first hippo in London Zoo, for example, is really interesting as well, and I hope to be able to delve into these more in the future. Yeah, Jumbo the elephant. I read a lot about him during my archive research in London Zoo. He was a true iconic animal as well. Where is the museum that is reopening located in Amsterdam? It is adjacent to Amsterdam Zoo. It's a big building attached to the zoo. So if you visit Amsterdam Zoo in the future, you will see the building, and hopefully when it opens sometime next year, but there isn't a due date for that yet. Animal acts and circuses have lost favor here in the US. Is that in Europe, so in Europe as well? Circuses, yes. In most European countries, circuses involving and performing animals are outlawed. Yes, for many years.
Okay. Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
What is your background? Are you an historian or you're a zoologist?
I am a historian, but with a very, very keen interest in the natural world. So I know a lot about animals and nature in general as well. And yeah, during my studies, I've always aimed to yeah, to combine these two interests. And I have been working at Amsterdam Zoo for 8 years now as a tour guide. So I'm well versed in zoo history and the zoo world. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Before I came to work in a natural history museum, I worked in the zoo, also.
Okay.
And
which one?
in the safari park of Ramat Gan in Israel.
Oh, okay.
And when I started working there in the early 80s of the early 20th century, we were moving the zoo from Tel Aviv to Ramat Gan. In my museum now, I have some animals that didn't survive the moving.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very nice because I used to know them personally as living animals, and now I meet them at the museum as specimens at the museum, and it's very interesting to see that people they get attached to specimen in a museum that they can hear a personal story about them, that someone knew these animals. It's not only a specimen; it becomes something real for them. And it's very interesting to see how the crowd visitors respond to these animals.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if Jack were to be displayed in this future museum, that he can, like I said, offer a tale many people can relate to. Yes.
We have some more questions.
Are there any more questions?
No, I don't think so. So, do we have any remarks from the speakers that they would like to say something about the presentations? Okay. So we will wrap for tonight, and we have another sessions in I think it's in some 5 hours. So you're invited to join the other sessions, and I hope to see you tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. And thank you very much for staying with us, listening to us, and all the sessions is recorded, so if you would like to get in touch with one of the speakers, and you can rewatch the session and get in touch. So thank you very much for listening.